All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very honored to be sitting down with Anthem Blanchard. He's the co-founder of HeraSoft Development, which provides ransomware-proof solutions for enterprise businesses in the precious metal space. Particularly, thank you so much for joining us today, Anthem.
My honor, and thank you, Justin, for hosting. It's an honor to reconnect with you. It's been a bit. It's been a bit too long.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely. So we'll get into that maybe a little bit later, but I wanted to kind of start us off today with talking about, so what are your thoughts on these price actions that we're seeing in the precious metals and crypto?
Again, first, thank you, and I think we have to all remember that with the CARES Act, we're talking about roughly $3 trillion documented, added, and really, the vast majority of that going into debt that has to be repaid. And the raw physics of the matter is that all debt that has to be repaid has to be repaid in whatever currency that debt is denominated in. In this case, those trillions were trillions of dollars, U.S. dollars, and so the reality is that we've just seen a massive. Ultimately, as we remember, when there's fractional reserve banking, as there is today, and there's been for decades, centuries, really, and millennia, really, that and today we have a zero reserve requirement for banks to make loans off of, which basically means banks can make discretionary loans on spec. You would think of it like a home builder, and this is basically on spec lending effectively. And so complete discretion with, of course, there are some guideline range bounds that the federal government does provide, that comes from Bank of International Settlements, that kind of comes from really the banks themselves. And so really we've seen, you could argue for that 2-3 trillion, more like 80 to 100 trillion dollars really added this year at least, because really 30 to 50 to 1 of a leverage ratio when you put that dollar into a bank, any commercial bank in the world, and especially U.S. banks that are some of the most efficient in the planet, maybe only eclipsed by United Kingdom related banks. But effectively, a lot of leverage can be achieved, and future value brought present value, which is really what leverage is, ultimately, and what debt-based societies do. And so I think we could see gold eclipse $2,000 an ounce, silver eclipse $40 an ounce. Those phenomena wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me also to see a big crash of general securities and equities, maybe even before then in a rebound. I mean, we're seeing such a warp speed based year, and we've really been hit psychologically, I think, as individuals that are plugged into these commercial forced marketplace communication mechanisms, with just so much noise that and really so much money and credit, and we're seeing zero interest rates around the world, and interest rates the price of money, and that means that the money wells, quote unquote, are dry, quote unquote. It's like oil wells being dry, there's no more oil. And so what that really means is that banks are pleading and governments are pleading to give away money to try to put it to some kind of quote unquote commercial use, but to no effect, because nobody's able to make money anymore with the system of centralization and forced marketplaces, which is kind of what I refer to as the government-based system. Voluntary marketplaces, which is what I refer to as what Bitcoin enabled and ultimately will become once other public protocols are around to effectively chassis the wild horse stallion of Bitcoin, if you will, like similar to how horses stir up rain, so forth. And all of a sudden, the energy of the horse becomes much more controllable. So too, I see the horse of Bitcoin now being controllable for commercial purposes, and that ultimate level of security, of data security that Bitcoin created and is still by far number one versus any other public protocol, can provide that level of data security with.
You and I both came to the cryptocurrency industry back when it was essentially just Bitcoin and Litecoin from the precious metals industry. Could you talk about that journey from focusing on precious metals, which is an alternative asset, and then discovering Bitcoin, which at that time was still, had already been considered by many a digital gold as opposed to an electronic peer-to-peer cash system, although at that time it was considered widely both. And how you've managed to combine the two.
Well, it's really been an accident. I'm adopted, first of all, into an amazing love based family. My dad, James U. Blanchard, interviewed Frederick August Hayek when I was 5 years old in 1984, shortly after he joined the board of directors of the Cato Institute. And that video is actually on libertarianism.org and also transcribed on Cato Institute's website. James U. Blanchard III was my dad's name. He passed away 21 years ago. And he and Hayek basically talk about the idea of having a sly way to introduce money that government can't stop, and that's effectively what Bitcoin was, and what the person slash group slash pseudonym slash whatever Satoshi Nakamoto slash founders slash creators of Bitcoin public protocol really invented this concept, really. So I came at it from a digital e-currency, like you mentioned, digital e-gold currency, specifically as you referenced. And in 2002, my dad was one of the first 10 investors, effectively, of gold money as a seed company that it had some patents that it had secured that said that the company had the IP rights in the US to monetize any commodity digitally in a double book entry accounting system and coin it as money, quote unquote, effectively. And so that was something that appealed to me out of Emory University, BBA Finance Accounting major, and '02, and decided to work with the company. They graciously let me work there, of course. Nothing's guaranteed. And I was able to work customer service and ended up performing a number of different roles, helping with our accounting and helping with our auditing, really more specifically there in the processes, and helping with the business modeling, the pricing, board secretary I played for a while. So really an awesome experience, and valuable. And left when I left operationally in 2008, the company was over 360 million in assets of clients when it was under a million when I first arrived in 2002. And during my time there, I'd met a guy named Trace Mayer, and I fielded the vast majority of all the business development. And Trace was a guy that had met one of the co-founders, James Turk of Gold Money, and so I got introduced, and he was just a bastion of all these incredible ideas, and a lot of them I had thought of, and for various reasons, the timing or there was resistance or what have you. But market timing usually is the issue, and became friends with Trace. And over the years, basically, he started to educate me about Bitcoin. And really, it was about in 2012 that I made the plunge toward the end of it with Trace, kind of being my shepherd, if you will, there. And my wife and I, Cynthia and I, were already about a year into founding our own company that is a precious metal savings platform called Anthem Vault. And so we were really, really curious once we had really heard about Bitcoin, pretty early days, as a software platform to chassis precious metals, really, and use it as like a e-currency platform, if you will, but peer-to-peer transferable, like Bitcoin software keys are. And so that was really our entree or entry, if you will, into Bitcoin and quote unquote cryptocurrency, which are really tokens, quote unquote, which are really software keys that access distributed software, which we like to refer to a lot as public protocols, because the protocols are essentially quote unquote public for anyone to access and then apply, so long as the specifications from a mathematical standpoint are achieved, whether that be hardware, whether that be software in the form of software keys, an adequate number of software keys to access the distributed software, quote unquote public protocol, quote unquote public blockchain. So that's kind of my foray. I think we met about 8 years ago or so. And, you know, it's interesting. Now we're kind of meeting again or reconnecting. And, I'm really grateful for the opportunity. And It's amazing because I think we're on the cusp of now really seeing these distributed softwares be able to crystallize and commercialize. And that was really kind of what led us into ransomware proof solutions with our company now, HeraSoft Development. And our team effectively built the world's first digital gold cryptocurrency as a prototype 6 years ago. So if you Google Reuters, Independence Coin, Anthem Vault, you'll see an article by a guy named Frank Tang, a reporter. And we technically did make the first ever gold backed crypto, quote unquote, or fully gold backed crypto. It was X11 script, which for those that are really into it, that's Dash or was Darkcoin back in 2014, and we basically made 10 million of our INN coins mineable for 100 grams of gold in total. And we made 100,000 of these quote unquote tokens, redeemable software keys, redeemable for 1 gram of digital gold as a good that the key accessed. And we ended up getting about close to 10% redemption. I think we had like 8 or 9%. But the big deal was that the 3 months after we launched in July of 2014, our acquisition cost on Anthem Vault, our free savings platform, which we do require everyone to ID verify themselves, which is kind of a lot more than a typical dealer would on a buying precious metal, as you know. But we just chose that as a barrier to help really minimize fraud from the onset. And we ended up lowering our acquisition cost to under $3, which included the cost of vetting, which was about half of that cost roughly, from over $100 the quarter prior. And so we really were realized we had something that could have serious market potential with gold and crypto, quote unquote, or gold and distributed software. So we started down the rabbit hole of tinkering and hobbying and developing in public protocol. And a year later, we built a platform called Hyatt Gold that we got a lot of play, like a full page in the Financial Times, and Business Insider covered it. And that was about we had about 500 some odd people plus that we had a gold token that was like a quote unquote checking account equivalent in concept to the savings account equivalent Anthem Vault savings platform, metal savings platform in practice. And what happened is that we were so early with the concept back in the middle of 2015 that we were pre any kind of U.S. or really global regulation on what this thing was really from a regulatory classification. And shortly thereafter, in August of 2015, the U.S. government came out with this designation of like anything that was quote unquote backed by any kind of software key was considered to be a money service type activity, quote unquote, which is about 10 levels more regulatory onerous than a precious metal type company, which is about 10 times more regulatory onerous. This is all relevant for just opening up a bank account, basically, than like 10 times more onerous than like a regular type of a business from a regulatory, anti-money laundering, know your client regime, risk assessment. And so effectively, we had to cease all of our development to public protocol in any kind of commercial capacity until we spun out all of the intellectual property related to these distributed software, public protocol, gold, crypto, what have you, all of the software development that we did into a new company that we called Anthem Gold. And that happened about 3 years ago. We ended up doing a successful seed round financing on a online investment platform called banktothefuture.com, which has processed over $1 billion of financings as an online investment platform. Ourselves, we did about 630,000 in the magical Bitcoin year, quote unquote, of 2017, or one of the magical of many. And that was a great experience because we ended up luckily raising about 2/3 in Bitcoin, and we ended up being able to achieve effectively almost 2.5 relative to what we had to start with. So we turned about 630,000 into about 1.5 million, which ended up enabling us to develop a track and trace guaranteed incorruptible data inventory log solution that we called Hercules. Herc.1, HERC is the name of the software key to the public protocol, to the distributed software of Hercules. And effectively, we realized that we had to make the solution scalable, and we ended up making it scalable to, first our Anthem Gold solution, which is a U.S. based gold, quote unquote, stable coin based in Texas. It's a Class 3 Lloyd's insured vault. It's an Ethereum based token, and Hercules is an Ethereum processed, secured software key. Ultimately, a token, HERC, in the public protocol is distributed and processed by Ethereum, and it uses a stack layer solution of Factom to secure in a distributed fashion into Bitcoin, the ultimate trusted record that's never been breached in terms of edited, changed in a corruptible way since January 3rd, 2009, every about 10, 15 minutes or so, depending on demand on the network and demand and protecting the network. And we use a combination of a public protocol called Interplanetary File System, or IPFS, and another called STORJ, or storage. That is a combination of public-private distributed storage clouds, data storage clouds in particular. And using this solution, we effectively have a recipe of Hercules, and Hera is effectively like our Red Hat IBM equivalent to our Hercules LAMP Linux open source database stack, and Hercules is just 100% distributed stack. Both open source types of software, but just distributed versus centralized ultimately.
That's great.
So that's kind of the narrative of 9.5 years operationally now with Anthem Vault and Anthem Gold and Amagi metals. We actually bought about 5 years ago. Actually, Trace turned me on to that as well at first. And the founder, Stephen McCaskill. Amagi was kind of, for some Bitcoinist history buffs, used to be the largest vendor of Satoshis really up until about 2013, known because they were the largest vendor of BitPays up until about 2013. So we ended up purchasing the assets and a lot of liabilities in 2015 from that company. So, and kind of kept the tradition going. And then, then Hercules, we spun out of Anthem Gold, and then Hera, effectively, we spun out of our holding company that we did a short form merger of last year, which means we had 90% plus approval. And that was really on the suggestion mainly of Brock Pierce, actually, interestingly enough. I had the real humbling privilege of spending, about a month and a half or so with Brock last year, about 5, 6 instances. He invited me to stay at his hotel. So I, was very gladly, was very happy to learn from who I consider probably the number one uh, innovator and pioneer of digital assets, starting with his time at Disney as a child actor to, getting involved in video games, hired Steve Bannon, who, obviously the current U.S. president hired successfully. It really got into cryptocurrency, quote unquote, public protocol, quote unquote, distributed software, quote unquote, very, very early. Was one of the co-founders of Counterparty, which was a protocol that we ultimately used for the Hayek Gold implementation that I mentioned 5 years ago. And that was really the first, quote unquote, ICO, initial coin offering, master coin, really. And so Counterparty is kind of, was kind of like an evolution, basically, but, effectively, and Tether as well, which is kind of the most successful stablecoin today, and has achieved more volume on secondary markets, quote unquote, token exchanges, than even Satoshis right now, or certainly Ether, or other distributed software keys. So, and that was really a great move. That really helped align us to be able to accept institutional funds as well as the environment. Cambridge Associates a few years ago opening the doors. The U.S. Treasury just announced that banks could legally custody cryptocurrency without issue from regulatory standpoint, presumably OCC, I'm guessing U.S. Treasury Office of, I think, Controller of the Currency, so Controller. So, it's really kind of great times. I think we're really on the cusp of seeing Bitcoin, Ethereum, other public protocols out there really commercialized, and really blossom and really become commercial software. Used materially, indispensably, better, cheaper, faster than any traditional database software today by eliminating the middleman being the centralized database.
You've got a ton of experience as a entrepreneur. So I'm curious. I'd like to get into a little bit like what lessons of business did you learn from your dad? And then also like what challenges have you faced that you think entrepreneurs generally face and how you overcame those?
I would say the lessons looking back, 40 years now, my dad passed away 21 years ago. I would say the best two lessons are be fearless and follow your convictions. And those are very, very easy things to say and very, very difficult things to do. But I think that the key to being fearless and to following your convictions is to find one's passion. And I think the key to find one's passion is to stay as continuously curious as you possibly can as a mantra. And I think if one can kind of keep it that simple, there's a good chance that one will find their kind of utopia kind of passion. It's just very difficult to stay patient and vigilant to that extent. To really follow one's passion, love, passion, because that should lead really to the purpose. What is one's quote unquote purpose? And, it really, it's irrespective of how another's outlook is, big or small. It just really matters to oneself. And I think that, those are lessons that I really take from my parents and, you know, ultimately, follow your convictions, another way to think of that is control the tempo or set the tempo, quote unquote. And I think it's important to also realize that we are still in a forced marketplace based world of kill or be killed where corrupted records rules the business world. And until public protocols, distributed software commercialize, still kill or be killed prisoners dilemma game theory rules of collusion, lie, cheat, steal, deception, because one has to assume that they're being deceived because it's impossible to prove otherwise for any of the parties. And that's ultimately the crux of the problem. And, that's why we have, forced spirituality with religion, forced marketplace with governments, because we have to have reprisal and forgiveness because all is arbitrary. The world has been a great stage for, as long as we've even known of corrupted, quote unquote, recorded history, quote unquote, because the reality is until trusted record, which really we've ever known in, corrupted history is really Bitcoin. And then now there's obviously many, many others, but, Bitcoin obviously being way, way, way stronger. And so really gave us the first trusted record that was impossible for people to collude against because of the game theory of the incentive structure of the mirrors of all of the quote unquote nodes, all the quote unquote instances, all the quote unquote hardware, all the quote unquote computers running quote unquote, applying quote unquote the application, the program, quote unquote, service, the digital service, right? That's being applied, that there's an incentive to maintain a consistent record. And it's asymmetric to try to disrupt the record. And that's as a critical of an important concept. The asymmetric aspect of, not really worth it so much. I mean, because the amount of energy that it would take to disrupt would be disproportionately expensive to the amount of financial gain, presumably, of shorting, quote unquote, betting by borrowing effectively, betting that the price relatively of whatever currency the loan was made in was going to go down right before the tokens, quote unquote, the software keys, quote unquote, Satoshis, quote unquote, or other peer-to-peer distributed software keys had to be repaid to fulfill the loan, which is how a short, quote unquote, basically works.
What advice do you have for entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs today?
Stay curious, and stay vigilant and to your convictions, and stay humble, you know, and I think, pray regularly. I think it's important to maintain spirituality. I think it's important to stay humble. Um, it's important to communicate a lot because only through communication is love actualized, and love and value are synonymous. And it's important to understand we are shifting really, really fast into an access based ownership. And if you're under 30 years old, probably a 90% plus chance it's intuitive to you. But if you're over 30 or especially 40, which basically I am now, then it's probably a majority percent chance it's not intuitive because the majority of us over 40 have lived the majority of our adult life and still do to this day, technically, in an ownership dominated society. Now, the momentum has shifted in the last 10 years. How do I say that? Uber, Airbnb, quote unquote, sharing economy, really distributed software, public protocols, software keys are a form of barter, or a form of sharing, whereas money is a third party conduit currency that has to be defined, quote unquote, as money. And if it has to be defined as money, it has to be defensed as money, a third party conduit currency. And something that has to be defensed can be aggressed and is therefore violent. Whereas Satoshis provide direct access to the service of the strongest record on the universe that we know of. So that we can access. So and have write access to and have read access to as well. So that's really, really relevant because ultimately commerce is just a form of communication. Business is just a form of communication. And remember, only through communication is love actualized or realized.
So I'm curious now, like, where do you see the precious metals market moving? In 2012, I was fully immersed in the precious metals market. And then, just like you, Trace Mayer had a discussion with me. And next thing I knew, I was on this journey of cryptocurrency, particularly Bitcoin at that time. And leading up to that point in the precious metals industry, say from 2010 to 2012, probably more 2011, 2012 than anything, a lot of gold bugs were quite curious about this Bitcoin thing, this digital gold, but they were very skeptical of it at the same time. They didn't like that it wasn't tangible, for instance. They maybe didn't like that its origin story was so unknown. Nobody knew who
Mm-hmm.
Satoshi Nakamoto was. And then furthermore, they were also an older crowd,
Mm-hmm.
and also oftentimes also a religious crowd who, I believe, like gold and silver has kind of a place throughout history, particularly even our theology. And they were skeptical of it in 2012. As my generation, I'm 33 now, was kind of turned our focus, those of us who are interested in alternative assets, to Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
Attention on particularly silver waned because I think that the younger generation was more interested in silver. It's easier to accumulate, for instance. And I saw, or I felt rather, that attention on silver really decreased. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately, probably particularly over the last like 6 months to a year. Like, what was the effect of all that attention being taken off of silver by the younger generation? Was it
Mm-hmm.
completely good? I mean, cryptocurrency is such an important technology and has so many benefits, but I also think that silver has a place in one's portfolio or in
Yeah.
the world. And my opinion is that, like, just like individuals like Gary Vaynerchuk talk about sporting cards and
Mm-hmm.
nostalgia factor thereof, and how like trading cards are going to have some sort of like, or rather just that nostalgia plays,
Mm-hmm.
I think that we could see the same development in silver over the years, like even as simple as these Marvel comic rounds that are printed or created
Mm-hmm.
by the Perth Mint. I think these are very popular, even amongst those who are not familiar with the investment thesis of something like silver or Disney coins, which have been minted for many, many years. I think people could get interested in those things, even though they don't understand the investment thesis of precious metals. Not only
Mm-hmm.
Disney and Marvel, but also there's 7-Eleven coins I've seen. There's Coca-Cola coins I've seen. There's Pepsi
Mm-hmm.
coins, NRA coins.
Yeah, the
I
Coca-Cola ones are actually very cool. Not to like tout Emory University that I went to that has a lot of Coke stock, but actually I legitimately saw some like bottle caps that are actually coins that are really, really cool. I forget it's like Tonga or one of the mints. My dad actually was one of the original people that kind of thought of this idea of like these tiny little governments doing their own mints, basically as a source of revenue for themselves. Wildly enough, which obviously would hopefully trickle down to some of the people somewhere in theory. But
Hmm.
I think it's a brilliant what you're talking about. I think you're really obviously awesome on your timing, given how early you were with Bitcoin alone. And so I think what you're onto is a really savvy concept. I mean, I think of Bitcoin as like a rocket ship, and I think of gold as like a parachute. And I think of like silver as kind of like a reserve parachute. And then I think of like Ethereum or then like other, public protocols, distributed software, and really, those buying or quote unquote speculating, on those software keys is like multi-stage rockets. You know what I mean? Like it's so they're all important components to your mission, which is happiness and enjoyment. Ultimately, I think so self, right? And so but then others, ultimately, that's the paradox, right? So and so I think that we still do live in boom bust cycles of forced marketplaces and decentralized money violent currency mechanisms, and so therefore it does make sense that as a parachute, gold and silver can be really good, especially, assuming that we don't have unlimited life expectancies, which we don't, right? At least don't now. Maybe we won't ever. So we definitely don't now today, so right, we can agree to that, right? So, we all live a certain amount of time, and therefore the value, quote unquote, that we have that we're really speculating on, unless we're really matching up the value we have for some kind of budgeted expense, then really, it's all about finding that mix of volatility, which you always want some of, relative to lack of price volatility, relative to whatever currency you're spending most to live your life and enjoy your life with, you, your family, your loved ones, whomever, your pets, your kids, your grandkids, your whomever's, anyone's, animals, whatever, life, trees, whatever you like. So, as long as you're not hurting anyone else, as far as I'm concerned. So, great. So, um, but yeah, I think it's really a matter of timing is everything. I think that with $100 trillion basically of non-base U.S. dollars created this year with the CARES Act, and most of that going to commercial banks. And commercial banks have zero deposit requirements today, so they can have $1 in deposits in theory and have a loan of $1 million off of the $1, and that would be perfectly legal if the bank wanted to do that in theory. Although there are probably some other guidelines at banks that they're not supposed to technically, but you know how it is. The rules are arbitrarily enforced if they're not math based, like they are with distributed software public protocols. So you never really know with language which way it's going to go when it's not math based and it's word based and rhetorical.
So I'm curious, like, what's the biggest challenge that you faced in business, and like, how did you overcome it, or set of challenges?
I would say staying fearless is the hardest thing because it's really, really scary. It's you have to say no a whole lot more than you ever really want to, and it's never really easy, even when you get really, really used to it. But it's so critical to say no, in business, and I think yes in life a lot. And um, that's difficult when you have to intertwine the two, which you do with forced marketplace, and you have to have culture and cult of personality and personas that this person's the this person and the that person and the this person. They have to fit into a mold, into how they look, how they sound, how they act, how they behave, how they work, quote unquote. And so this is necessary to form cults of personality and groups with prisoner's dilemma and kill or be killed and such. It's why we have wars, it's why we have violence and pandemics and things. So it's all sorts of reasons why we have this crazy behavior. It seems crazy. I mean, we could have free water for everyone, probably cleaner than anywhere on the planet today, for under $1 trillion, and yet we basically was created $100 trillion basically this year with the CARES Act. And like, where is it really going to go toward bettering ourselves, our life expectancy, our quality of life? I think these are the questions. Why aren't we having a debt jubilee? Why aren't we having hyperinflation this time? Why aren't these biblical events happening when they used to happen about every 50 years or so all over the planet? And I would argue that that's an example of the transition. Moore's law ending about 10 years ago after about half a century or so of semiconductors doubling in speed about every 4 years at the same price, dollar wise. And that ended about 10 years ago. The entire financial system having to get resuscitate itself, regurgitate itself about 10, 12 years ago with AIG bailed out, when AIG was really the insurer of last resort, but really it was the Federal Reserve of last resort, and then really the U.S. Treasury of last resort. So, right, all of these forced hierarchy layers are basically being deemed irrelevant. And now these voluntary layer hierarchies are basically coming to the forefront. And we're basically deciding, just like kind of we decided to use Google Meet. No one forced us to, or no one forced us to use smartphones or laptops or the internet. We just liked them because they provided services and goods better, cheaper, faster than the brick and mortar analog based services that we were accustomed to receiving our goods and services from prior. So, or through dumb phones, right? Or through, Lycos.com instead of Google, or Yahoo.com, right?
Well, if you know an alternative to Google Meet, let me know. It doesn't even have to be cheaper, better, faster, but comparable works.
I gotta give Google some kudos because I'd really kind of shied away from Meet for a while, but I think like Zoom forced them to step up their game, and like that's the forced marketplace. I mean, you see it. You know, if it were sustainable, it'd be great, but that's really the power of marketplace and the magic of marketplace. In general, and so the beauty of it not being forced and being voluntary even the next 10 years and actualize in the next 10 years, all foundation, hard and secured off of Bitcoin, of course, it is really infinitely better, faster, cheaper services, everything in our world becoming hardware, as benign as clothing or household goods, becoming mini routers, servers, mini transistors, input outputters, mini processors, RAMs, hard drives, basically kind of the opposite of 5G. That we're going to have mini micro mesh because Bitcoin core roughly original is, supposedly around 40,000 lines or so of code on like a traditional, like, whatever, 17-inch computer screen or something like that. Then, you're talking like Google operating system, like for Chromebook or like Windows, operating system or Apple OS. I mean, you're talking probably thousands of times more code than that easily for their base, right? And because the reason is because centralized database software applications are never secure. They're never going to get to a one of secure, of trust. There'll always be some decimal. And that means you can't round up with trust. It'll only round down. That's how it works. And so by distributing the application, which is what Bitcoin figured out effectively, that eliminates the attack vector of the central database where the application is housed and the data is housed being compromised. And it eliminates the attack of ransomware, which is rampant. I mean, we're talking like it's probably over $500 billion of cost today annually for governments and private organizations, and probably doubling now about every 6 months. It's getting rampant in large part because of the economic environment, in large part because of the liquidity of the bounty, which is also software access keys to distributed software. Because basically, ransomware only really came on the map as a material problem to businesses and governments about 7 years ago. Yet, ransomware as an attack vector has been around since the 80s with floppy disk attacks. People used to have to send checks to like Panama City, Panama for some cipher code that some rogue black hat, developer stuck in one of his, ad hoc, consulting gigs for some, software company, right? And they, stuck a bunch of these versions with his own version, right? Or her own version, right? But then basically once the Bank Secrecy Act and especially the Patriot Act, that kind of stuff was totally impossible to clear checks like that or money like that or wires or ACH or equivalent funds, payments, bank payments, basically more generically abstract. Hence, we saw the attacks because people could get bounty the last 7 years because Satoshi's, Tether, Ether, all these other software keys gained so much liquidity on secondary markets from speculation. So it's now the only thing that's really eclipsed, the last 11 years of Bitcoin's market cap increase of Satoshi's, specifically, quote unquote, the software keys, is actually ransomware. And in large part, I think a lot of the pandemic now is because of the ransomware threats, that they're the most understated attack of all.
Now, in conclusion, Anthem, what do you have to say either on entrepreneurship or crypto or precious metals or life itself?
I would just say, stay, curious, follow your purpose, find your purpose by staying curious and, stay passionate, stay love based, follow your passion, follow your love. Sunshine cures all, love wins always, karma's real. Being able to really stay there is incredibly impossible. But, in that duality of impossibility is the singularity of the possibility. Let the river flow. Um, it's a ride, it's a joyride, and it's also, comfort is temporary. And the more we can all achieve better commerce through better transparency, better accountability, we're going to have a more peaceful world. We're going to have much more fun, better, faster, cheaper services, goods, amusement, recreation, entertainment, um, you name it, all the things that we all love and have to do, will become more pleasurable or less painful or both.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Anthem, for joining us today. We've spoken with Anthem Blanchard, who's the co-founder of HeraSoft Development, and so much more, really. But Hera in particular, that's a ransomware-proof solution for enterprise. Thank you, Anthem.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to you, Justin. Yeah, we have a splash page right now. It's herasoftdev.com. You can, leave your questions. HERC.ONE is Hercules Protocol. Anthemgold.com, if you're into the gold stablecoin, is the Texas based. We also have the world's first, or that we know of, or only currently 24/7 Lloyd's videoed, allocated gold vault on Anthem Gold's website. And you can see the showcase of Hercules for the incorruptible inventory log using the Android-based application if you click the Herc asset list. And then Anthem Vault is our original. It's our metal, gold, silver platform that you can save in. And then Amagi Metals, of course, is our dropship if you want dropship. Really grateful for the opportunity to educate, Justin, very much.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Anthem, and thank you, everyone, for listening. Have a great day.